Welcome to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Delegate David Bulova, who represents the House District 37 here in Fairfax County. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Delegate Bulova.
It is great to be here. Thank you so much.
We should assure our listening audience that we are not actually together except electronically. You are at your home, and I am at my home, respecting the social distancing that our governor has asked us to implement at this time while we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd like to get started by introducing you to our listening audience. Not everyone outside of Fairfax City and parts of Fairfax and Centerville, which is your district, may know about your background, when you started in the House of Delegates and how the House of Delegates has changed in the years that you've been there. This has been a very historic session, and so I'd like for people to sort of understand the years of your being in the House that have led up to what happened this year.
Yeah, no, and thank you very much. This is about as good as social distancing as you're going to be able to pull off. But yeah, in terms of background, I'm one of those folks who actually grew up here in Fairfax County, and so I grew up in Kings Park West and went to Laurel Ridge Elementary and Robinson High School. So I've seen kind of firsthand how Fairfax County has changed very dramatically over the decades. In fact, when I was growing up, my neighborhood was kind of at the edge of suburban sprawl, and now we're kind of right in the middle of it. And when I was little, I spent most of my time, quite frankly, playing out in the local creek and in the woods, building forts and stuff like that. When I was a kid, I always kind of dreamed of public service. Didn't have any particular thing in mind, but I lucked out because I had a really great mentor, and that was my mom, Sharon Bulova, who, when I was in high school, started getting active in civics, and then decided to run for office herself as the Braddock District Supervisor in 1987. And so for me, it was just an amazing way to kind of see how the public process worked up front, and I loved the way that she engaged the public in the decision-making process. And that always really made a huge impact on me. And so when I graduated from college and settled down and started raising my family, only a couple miles from where I grew up, I decided I wanted to also get involved. And so, was involved in the Fairfax County Consumer Protection Commission, was active on brain injury services, and then, hearkening back to those days spent, in the woods, decided I would run for my very first office, which was the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. Most people don't realize that we have a whole elected office in Fairfax County just devoted to the environment and conservation. And so was quite frankly expecting to sit in that role for a while until my delegate, who's now Senator Chap Peterson, decided he was going to run for statewide office and left an open seat. And, at that point, I had two small kids, and I was like, well, this sounds like it would be something that I would want to do. And that's when my wife, Gretchen, who you know very, very well, kind of turned to me and she said, David, if you're not going to run, what on earth have we been doing all this for all these years? And so it was great to have, a family that was 110% behind me. But I've loved, representing the 37th district. I love the state stuff, and I one of the things and why I really like being on shows like this is that people around here tend to focus on the local stuff. They tend to focus a lot on the federal stuff, and they really forget how absolutely critical the state is with respect to almost every aspect of our lives.
And do you think, too, that because most of our state legislation takes effect July 1st rather than like January 1st, that people kind of miss that laws are being made, but they don't happen immediately after session is over in March. There's this kind of weird delay, and then all of these laws become effective July 1. And I think a lot of people kind of miss that in the run-up to the 4th of July and the summer vacation, that there's this whole host of new laws and new regulations that are suddenly in effect. And that's certainly going to be true this year on July 1.
It certainly will, and so there's that timing disconnect. There's also just the fact that there's a lot going on in the January timeframe with the holidays, and so people kind of miss the fact that we're all convening down there in the General Assembly, and frankly, they're surprised that we're down there making those laws, and it is hard to engage people because they figure that they have lots of time, when in fact we squeeze decision making into a 60-day period, and it's very, very fast paced. And so you'll have people who will come to you with issues in March or April or in May saying, hey, I hope you vote against this or vote for that, and you have to politely tell them we made that decision 2 months ago. And so getting people recognizing that we have a General Assembly that meets for a very short period of time, that's one of the challenges of being in the state House of Delegates or the State General Assembly.
And the fact that we have a part-time legislature at all is its own subject of debate, in my opinion, for a state as large as the Commonwealth, as large as ours, and the fact that we have an enormous economy and it's growing bigger every moment. By the time Amazon brings their HQ2 here, they're going to be joining many multinational corporations who are based here, especially in Northern Virginia. And so a part-time legislature, to many, including myself, would seem to be inadequate to the task. But that's just, I don't want to veer off into that advocate spot, but I'm just putting it out there for people to consider that 45 days or 60 days, and it alternates depending on whether it's an even or odd year, that includes weekends. And that is simply not enough time to hear literally thousands of bills that have been drafted and posted, and citizens are interested in these issues, but the window is often too short for people to get to Richmond or to get organized or to even get the word that important legislation is pending.
Yeah,
so,
and it is very short. And I guess one thing that folks don't, realize or think about is that we do meet in different commissions and committees throughout the year. And so where we're not actually making laws, it does provide kind of that extended opportunity for people to have input and to be able to help craft legislation that comes up during the short session. And you had mentioned Amazon, and I think a great example of this, and I didn't even realize this commission existed until this year, is we have something called the Major Economic Investments Commission, and they meet almost monthly throughout the year to oversee, issues related to things like Amazon and, do we want to invest in this or invest in that? But those are even more difficult sometimes to follow than even just the General Assembly itself.
That's true, and you have to have somebody who's organizing it, and this is where civic engagement becomes critically important. And I wish more Virginians really understood not only their own Commonwealth and how things specifically work here in Virginia, but, the points of engagement. You were on the Housing Commission 2 years ago, I think, when there was testimony about a bill that I was interested in you patroning, and that was home-based child care in developments that had HOAs. And that was a June, I think, hearing, and you were the chair, I believe.
The Common Interest Community Work Group,
Right, but if somebody hadn't been on that, if there was not advocates who had been working on that bill for years, I wouldn't have gotten the call to come. And so this is the other thing, is people need to pay attention and understand what organizations, many of which are all volunteer grassroots organizations, who are working really hard and often for years to get certain bills passed. And so I would encourage people listening to this broadcast to understand that if you have an issue or there's something you want to see changed in Virginia, first, look around and see who's already working on that issue, because undoubtedly there probably are people like yourself who are also interested in having something changed. And look around and become part of that movement, because, and I'm sure you'll address this specifically, it's constituents who come to their electeds, like you and to CHAP, that make the difference in what you patron, how you vote, how you talk about issues.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a great example. Constituents really do drive a lot of the agenda down there. And I had one constituent who came to me, this is probably about October, and wanted to know why there weren't stronger protections for individuals who were getting a student loan. And so I was like, oh, well, I don't know, it's not my area of expertise, but let me look into what we have and what we don't have. And after talking to our State Council of Higher Education, was able to figure out, all right, if you're getting a public student loan, there's actually quite a bit of counseling that takes place, a lot of information that one gets. But if you're getting a private student loan, it's all about the mechanics of the loan. And so it doesn't really provide the kind of information to the student or the family about whether this is a good deal. And so this year I put in a piece of legislation that if before providing a private student loan, that the bank providing the loan has to provide the student with information about the fact that Virginia has a student loan ombudsman that anybody can go to for advice about how to work with the lending agency, what kind of information is available on the State Council of Higher Education's website as far as earning potential of a particular career. So anyways, this was all because a constituent reached out with a question, and it prompted me to think, this is an area that we could address by law, to make sure that, more students get the information that is already out there.
And that is, in fact, an excellent example, and I'm sure you have more of those. For those of you who are just joining us, you're listening to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're talking with Delegate David Bulova, who represents the House District 37 here in Fairfax County. So I know you are on a number of different committees, and along with hearing from your constituents about bills that they're particularly concerned about, being on a particular committee means that even before bills get to the floor, they have to get through your committee. And so give us a little bit of insight into how that almost, I would call it a vetting process, happens during the legislative session.
Yeah, and so, when we go into a short or, a session in January and February where you've got either 45 or 60 days, depending on whether it's a short or a long session, you still deal with literally hundreds and thousands of bills. And so I think this last year was almost a record with 3,000 bills being introduced. And so the only way that you can work through those bills is by relying very heavily on the committee system, and in the House of Delegates also a subcommittee system. And so you become subject matter experts on issue areas, and then your colleagues assume that you've vetted through and have done your homework on the bills that are coming out of committee and onto the House floor. And so the areas, the committees that I'm on are general laws, education, and then agriculture, Chesapeake, and natural resources. And so within those realms, each session, we will deal with, anywhere between, 100 and 300 bills, depending on, what kind of issues are being thrown out there. And it's our job to really vet through those, kill the ones that we don't think are good ideas, fix ones that got potential, and then pass those off to the House floor. It's a hard process to follow sometimes, but it's a pretty good one because, I've sat on general laws, for instance, for the last 14 years. And so, you really do figure out what the nuances are of all that. And so general laws, in case you're interested, covers things like housing. It includes ABC, gaming, procurement, Freedom of Information Act, professions and occupations. So all those things, are within the purview of general laws. But yeah, we work through those things, and people, rely on the idea that, we know what we're talking about and can vet through those issues fairly.
And I think this would be a good point to interject, too, that every great idea comes with a price tag.
Yes.
And so in addition to vetting these in committee and voting them out of committee, they still have to have, and we have a biennium budget here in Virginia, so it's 2 years at a time. I think that's confusing to a lot of people because our governor is a one-term governor with 4 years, and how it works is your governor comes in on the previous governor's budget. So
right.
So there's a lot of, and believe me, I am no finance expert, But I do know that a lot of people are like, why didn't this bill pass? A lot of times it gets held up in appropriations because there simply is not already money in the budget, or it's not been identified by finance or the governor's office as something that is a priority for funding.
Right. Yep. And so our Constitution requires us to balance the budget every year. We can't print money in Virginia, and so if we think that an idea is good, we got to figure out how we're going to fund that through existing means or by raising the money elsewhere. And so it does make it tough. Now I'll tell you, one of the biggest differences from being in the minority to being in the majority is that we don't have the luxury of being able to vote yes for something over an appropriations, knowing that the other side is going to have to be in the unenviable position of killing what is otherwise a really good idea. And so, a great example, is that in the world of education, there is such an incredible need for additional funding. And so, for instance, this year, there was a real push for additional school counselors, and it's been a priority of mine and a priority of many of ours for many years. And so, of course, we're going to pass the policy over in education, but then, as you said, it goes over to appropriations. And so this year I was newly appointed to appropriations. That was a committee that I went ahead and picked up. And so it was kind of rough, having voted for the policy issue in education, and then all of a sudden having to sit over an appropriation saying, oh, shoot, now we can't afford to go ahead and do this. What do we do? And so, yeah, it's hard because now you're making really tough choices on policy issues that, matter to a great deal of people, and you've got to strike that right balance.
And there's great disparities in inequities in education, not just here in Fairfax County, and I think a lot of people are aware of that. Mm-hmm. One Fairfax is a priority that was put in place actually under Sharon Bulova when she was chair of the Board of Supervisors, that addresses for a wealthy county, a highly educated county, there's still pockets where there are students who don't have adequate food, where they don't have stable housing, where they don't have an internet connection or access to technology and things like that. But elsewhere in the state, too, rural schools where the population is shrinking, just having buildings where the ceilings don't leak. And you can get the students, across to another county high school because they have regional high schools. These disparities, and I'm sure that you see it being on education and also on appropriations, requires the wisdom of Solomon to make sure that all Virginians' needs are being met. But I think when you talk about school counselors, the school resource officers, and nurses, that gets complicated because that's not all state funding. Some of that is local too.
Right.
So again, it comes back to different areas of Virginia have different resources locally too.
Yeah.
So none of these are easy issues.
Yeah, and you're right. For a lot of these things, if we pass them, we might be able to afford at the state level to spend additional money on nurses. But, as you said, a lot of these, or if not most of them, require some kind of local match in order to be able to do that. And so we have to be cognizant of the fact that, if we vote to require, a lower ratio of students to counselors, we might be able to come up with our fair share. But there are going to be other parts of Virginia that are going to have a really tough time making that difference. And so how do you balance that all in the end?
No, like I said, I think you have a really tough job, and all legislators have a really tough job. You answer to your constituents, you listen to your constituents send you to Richmond, but you're still making laws on behalf of every person in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that's its own separate responsibility.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about some of the bills that you worked on this year. I mean, there were so many and so many groundbreaking, but of the ones that you worked on, I would love to hear about some of the things that you're the most excited about.
Yeah. Well, if I had to choose only one of my bills to get passed, it would definitely be the legislation I worked on with First Lady Pam Northam dealing with early childhood education. And so when we talked about increasing equity in our system, this is a very key component. And so when you think about it, what prepares a child to actually hit kindergarten ready to learn and succeed, it really has everything to do with those first 5 years. And so when you look at who is ready to enter kindergarten, it's a systemic problem all around. And so we have enough data to know that about 44% of Virginia children, when they enter kindergarten, they don't have the literacy or the math or the social emotional skills they need for success. But that is even more acute for at-risk children. And so 56% of those children from economically disadvantaged backgrounds aren't ready. And so that has huge implications, not only for K through 12, but also for the lifetime of the child. And so what we've been trying to do is make a paradigm shift. That early childhood education is really just a part of overall lifetime learning. And so how do you achieve that? And so there was a couple of different things that we worked on this year. One of them, and this isn't a minor task, was to consolidate the administration and oversight of early childhood education. And right now, the way that it is organized, it looks, if you did an org chart, it looks like you took a bowl of spaghetti and threw it up against the wall, and that was how things related to each other. And so we knew that we needed to make this simpler for efficiency, and also just so that parents would know, how to be able to get quality early childhood education. And that leads to the second part, which is that most programs, even if they are publicly funded, don't participate in Virginia's current voluntary quality standards for early childhood education. And so the big shift was, all right, if you're going to take public money, a parent should be able to rely on the fact that you are meeting certain quality standards. And so we set up a system to be able to shift us to say, what are those quality standards, and then how do we apply those across the board. So that was something I was really excited to be part of, just because I think that the long-term significance is going to make just a huge amount of difference in the lives of Virginians for generations and generations to come.
I completely agree with you. And for those of you who are just tuned in, you're listening to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Delegate David Bulova, representing the House District 37. So I think one of the shifts in talking about early childhood education, too, is to recognize that it's actually birth to 5. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people, when you talk about early childhood education, are thinking of preschool. But we need adequate, affordable, quality child care. And right. So when you talk about child care, people are not equating child care with early childhood education. But if you think about early childhood education as being from birth to 5, it makes us think differently about child care in general and the fact that there's not enough of it. And in Virginia, I think we have also struggled with things like state licensing. We're very fortunate here in Fairfax County. We've had the Office of Children since 1974, I think. Arlington and Alexandria also do, they provide permits for home-based child care, and we have more child care centers. And so I think getting people to pivot to think differently about early childhood education means we need to start thinking about where do the children of working parents go, and who is overseeing those very early experiences even before they get to universal pre-K.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was that pivot that's taken a couple years to be able to achieve, because you have folks who look at this and it's really the care and feeding of children between, like you said, birth and 5, and the way we want to look at it is how do you develop well-rounded little humans who you're setting up a foundation for a lifetime of learning. So it was exciting to be able to get something like that through.
Well, I know that this is something that education has always been something from the beginning that you've been interested in, and you do and are involved in the Education Committee and a lot of the bills surrounding education. And you represent Fairfax County well in that, because Fairfax County is a county that values our school system and our investment in education. It's the biggest budget item in the county budget. And so in that regard, I think they've sent you to Richmond to do the thing, and you are busy doing it. What are some of the other things that you worked on?
Well, and I think I introduced, I think it was 21 bills. And so bills are like your kids. You love all of them, and it's hard to distinguish. One of them that I thought was kind of cool that didn't get a lot of play, but I think will make a big difference, is a bill that requires the state to develop a wildlife corridor action plan. And so this was something that was completely last minute until I was approached by a group called the Wildlands Network and the Virginia Conservation Network. And so the issue is that as Virginia develops, you're basically bifurcating and fracturing, what are traditional wildlife corridors. That doesn't mean the wildlife goes away. It just means now, in order for them to do what they do, they've got to cross major roads and highways, and you wind up with automobile wildlife collisions that doesn't go very well for either party. And so, a statistic is that there are over 5,000 vehicle wildlife crashes per year, which is expensive and also, unfortunately, results in injury and loss of life. And so what this bill does is require the state to put together a plan that does two things. Number one, it's identify, where are the areas where you're having these collisions so that you can mitigate them. And there's ways of doing this through fencing and redesigning underpasses so that the wildlife can go through. But I think even more importantly, as VDOT looks at new construction or reconstruction, how do you avoid new problems from occurring? And so there was a great example outside Charlottesville where this kind of philosophy had been implemented, and it reduced their wildlife auto collisions by over 90%. And so that was pretty amazing. So, again, not something that's on the front of everybody's mind, but I know when I'm driving down a dark road at night, I'm always cognizant that, some deer very well may decide at that point to cross the road. We want to go ahead and try to avoid that where possible.
And that's a great example of exactly why people need to understand how you're working and the work that you're doing down in Richmond. We're going to go to a quick break. Please join us after this break. We are going to be talking some more with Delegate David Bulova from House District 37.
Radio Fairfax, the go-to station for a truly unique and rewarding listening experience. Made by producers who want to share their love of music, talk, or ideas with you. Free of commercial corporate radio control. Radio Fairfax, your voice, your station.
Colombia Espacion is a program that features great Latin music, including salsa, cumbia, and vallenato, amongst all Latin music genres. There'll be guest artists, live interviews, and sports segments. So tune in every Sunday at 9 a.m. and be a part of the Latin American community here on Radio Fairfax.
FM Odyssey is astonishing audiences with its freestyle fusion of legendary and contemporary rock artists, as well as interviews with talented musicians. FM Odyssey, Saturday morning at 7 on Radio Fairfax.
My grandma always says that everyone counts, and everyone who lives with us is special. Like my aunt, who took me on my first bus ride to the library, or my older cousin, who walked me to my first day of school. Even my mom's friend, who lives with us and brought her newborn baby home from the hospital. In our house, there's a lot of people to care for each other, and each one of them is special. My grandma, my cousin, and the baby who I have so much fun playing with. I love them all, and I'm so happy we all live together.
Every child needs to be counted on the 2020 census because the census makes every moment count by informing funding for schools, roads, healthcare, and more. So be sure all children in your home are counted on the 2020 census. It's your chance to help them for the next 10 years. You can respond online, by phone, or by mail. Shape your future. Start here. Learn more at 2020census.gov.
We're the Census Bureau. We measure America. So if you receive a survey from the Census Bureau, please participate right away. Your community is counting on you.
Welcome back to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we are talking with Delegate David Bulova, who represents the House District 37 here in Fairfax. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy quarantine to talk with us, Delegate Bulova.
Great to be here.
Where else are you going to be?
Yeah.
Really, it's like
live from the Bulova family kitchen table. Yeah.
That's right. Reach out, touch people. So we were talking about this wildlife corridor bill that we went to break, and how some people may not understand that that's a really important bill, and it's something that's going to impact anybody who drives in a car on a road where there are deer and bear and geese and all kinds of other wildlife, and that is certainly here in Fairfax County. So what are some of the other things we may not know about that you worked on this session?
Yeah, and another big one dealt with transparency of university donations. And so this is one, that came out of the fact that I represent George Mason University, and very proud to do so. To have a major university like that right in your backyard is such a blessing in so many different ways. But a couple of years ago, we were alerted to a not so great situation where it was discovered that the university had accepted some donations with strings attached that probably weren't appropriate. And so it really got the university looking at its own processes and procedures for accepting donations. But it also caused me to go back to look at our code and say, hey, if this could happen to George Mason University, it could happen to other universities. And how do we make sure that we can protect against inappropriate terms and conditions? This is also where, quite honestly, constituents played a huge part, because I was looking at one part of this issue and met with a group from George Mason University consisting of students and faculty and staff. And, they really kind of mapped out.
Would that be Transparent GMU?
Transparent GMU?
Yes. Is that the group?
That is the group.
Because I did a radio show with them earlier this year. So that's how. Yes, Uncoke My Campus and Transparent GMU, and they have done monumental work on transparency and donations. Yes,
and they did a great job of kind of laying out the larger issues, and one of them is that relationship between a university and its foundation, and so as the Supreme Court recently ruled that a foundation is separate and not subject to the Freedom of Information Act, you can't go into you can't request from them documents dealing with donations to them. The problem, and I didn't realize that this was the issue, is that a foundation will accept a donation with terms and conditions. But those terms and conditions aren't necessarily documented once that money is provided over to the university. And so the university is abiding by those terms and conditions, but there's no actual public document that somebody can point at and say, these are the terms and conditions that we were looking at. And so that's the legislation that we worked on down in the General Assembly this year, was just ensuring that as soon as a public university accepted terms and conditions, that there was some way for somebody to exercise the Freedom of Information Act to ensure that those donation terms and conditions were above board, and most importantly, that they didn't affect academic decision-making in an appropriate way.
Well, as an alumna of George Mason University, I thank you.
Yeah, and that one actually took a whole year. So kind of getting back to those issues that you can look at, is I had made an attempt to do that during the 2019 session. It wasn't quite ready for prime time, and so we had the Freedom of Information Advisory Council actually look into it and make recommendations for legislation back to the General Assembly. But as you kind of mentioned, unless you knew that there was something called the FOIA Council, it would be hard to know that thing existed and actually dives into information like this.
I think we should take a little, make our own little public service announcement here about how the world has changed from 2017 to 2020 as far as the makeup of, particularly of the House of Delegates. But in 2019, everything shifted and gave us a very different General Assembly here on the 400th anniversary. This is the 401st anniversary of the General Assembly. So give people a little bit of background about the fights you've been fighting and how the landscape has changed.
Yeah. Well, and so when I was first elected in 2006, the 37th district was squarely a swing district. And in fact, if you looked at it from Democratic and Republican performance, it was an exact 50-50 district. And I think when I went down there, I was one of 37 Democrats out of a House that had 100 individuals. And so some years we would gain some. Other years, I think we were all the way down there to 30 to 34, but it was always pretty lopsided. And then things changed rather dramatically in 2017, where we were expecting to pick up a couple of seats and woke up the next morning realizing that we were one away from tying it and two away from an outright majority. And then, that was, again in 2019 put us over the 50% mark, where there's now 55 Democrats. And so it really was a sea change, in a lot of ways. The two biggies were leadership roles. And so, where before, we were just simply members of committees, we, read the bills, we prepped for debate, and we showed up one or two times a week. Now, all of a sudden, we get to run these committees, and we're responsible for, what's docketed and how they're handled. But the other thing is that we were in charge of what could come out legislatively. And so there was a lot of really big issues, that were priorities to us. But we also understood that we needed to get the language right. The last thing we wanted was to pass legislation that wasn't ready for prime time, because then that's on us. If we're passing legislation that didn't think through all the details. But it was very different this year because there were days when we were voting on bills that we had been working on for a decade and a half, and all of a sudden, we were, passing big pieces of legislation every other day, every week. So it was a great feeling, but also a little daunting, again, because you knew that you needed to get it right, especially when the voters, look at us when we're standing for re-election in 2021.
Well, I had skin in the game on the Virginia Values Act, having been on the Board of Equality of Virginia for many years, and after 11 years of submitting a bill for employment non-discrimination just for public employees.
Yeah.
Suddenly there was a sea change this year. And what got signed into law was protections for public accommodation, employment, and housing. And you wouldn't think it would take a decade to get Virginians to accept that no one should be discriminated against.
Right. Well, and I know that one meant a huge amount to you, and it meant a lot to me. I mean, it meant a lot to a lot of people. But, for me, these are issues that come to general laws, where, I've sat on for the last 15 years. And so here I was now chair of the General Laws Committee, getting to preside over a process of finally being able to pass these. And the great thing, although it was a challenge, is in the past we had really focused on housing non-discrimination and non-discrimination in public employment, because those are the areas where we thought that we would have the most chance of being able to push forward. But this year we also looked at private employment and public accommodations. We wanted to make sure that we were working on a holistic policy. But it was really exciting to be able to get that done. It was a challenge, though, because there were a lot of moving parts. You wanted to make sure you kept a coalition together. I'll give you one example. On the housing side, the realtors have always been a great advocate for housing equality. But when we passed the first version of the bill out of subcommittee, there was an issue that had nothing to do with their commitment to equality. It had to do with the mechanics and how the law works. And so, afterwards, I just remember seeing, one of the lobbyists for the realtors and saying, hey, I'm going to grab you. We need to solve this. And literally we spent the next 2 hours on the phone, getting people together, getting a legal team together, and we were able to work through the issue. And it was exciting. It was great that we were able to go ahead and do that. But
I agree with you, and there's things that you don't anticipate, like once things go out of the House, and we'll explore a little bit more of that. Once things go out of the House, it has to go and be voted on in the Senate. And that's where a lot of things can be also upended, like trying to expand religious exemptions to some of these protections. For those of you who are just listening, tuned in to us, this is Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and I am talking with Delegate David Bulova this evening, and we are going over some of the exciting things that happened in the 2020 legislative session this year. So back a little bit to the fact that the House did tremendous work this year, and some of it actually got signed into law, and some of it didn't. So I'll let you pick and choose how you want to explain some of the things that didn't quite get passed this year.
Sure. And then maybe we can go back and talk about some of I think the great thing and the beautiful narrative is that this was a historic session. There were just an incredible number of things that we were able to pass, and so gun safety and criminal justice reform. We finally were able to pass a ban on texting and driving, requiring handheld. ERA was the first thing that we really voted on.
Truly. How can we not mention the ERA? Enormous, right?
So all those things we can dive into, because each of them has a pretty incredible story on its own. I think a couple of the big things that were left on the table, some of the healthcare issues, so reinsurance programs, campaign finance reform is also going to be another big area. And I again, there was it was very tempting to try to tackle everything in 1 year, and I think people realized that we need to make sure that we are pacing ourselves and doing these things right. But I think one of the big areas that we're going to have to deal with next year is campaign finance reform. What does that really look like? How do we make it meaningful but also simple? Given the fact that we are part-time legislatures and don't have professional staff to help us navigate something very complicated.
And a lot of people listening may not understand that in Virginia we don't have caps. In federal races, there's only so much you can give to a presidential candidate or to a congressional candidate, but there are not caps for the House of Delegates or the Senate or for statewide races. And a lot of money is coming in to Virginia because we are a bellwether state. For a long time, we were considered a swing state, and I think pretty much we're more blue than purple, but I don't take anything for granted. But campaign finance reform really is important because money has a tremendous undue effect and influence on races, and I think all of us would like to see that change.
And you're right. No, there are no caps. The only thing that we do have is some relatively decent transparency. And so for those who are listening, whoever are curious, you can go to a website called vpap.org and look up anybody who is running for or has run for state office, and then a lot of the local offices, and it will tell you everybody who's donated more than $100 to that person's campaign. And so it gives you a sense or a picture of who is supporting this person, and whether that's a person that you want to go ahead and support for public office. But other than that really great tool or resource, it's no holds bar in Virginia.
And I think we need to put a stop to that. But let's talk a little bit about, we mentioned kind of in passing that these laws become effective July 1, the ones that were passed, most of them. There are some exceptions, I'm sure, but most of them are July 1. When the coronavirus pandemic happened, all of a sudden, it impacted the economy of Virginia. And the economy is what drives tax revenue. And tax revenue is what funds our budget. And so when the veto session reconvened last week, it was basically the veto session. And you can explain why there is a veto session, but it ended up kind of being something that it wasn't meant to be, which was taking a look at whether or not going forward, Virginia will have the funds to actually support some of the bills that were passed.
Yeah. This was definitely a veto session or a reconvene session, unlike any other. And so typically the veto session is what we hold in mid-April to consider the governor's vetoes and whether we want to override any vetoes. But usually it's more about considering the governor's recommendations or amendments to legislation or the budget. And generally, you're looking at a couple dozen amendments that you're going to be considering. This year we considered several hundred of them, and it was because of exactly what you were just talking about, which is the budget. And so we passed what I thought was a really solid budget, and we made some really good investments, particularly with regard to public employees and public education, especially in early childhood and also higher education. But with the COVID epidemic, that really has hurt our budget. Now, for this fiscal year we're in right now, it's not too tough of an issue because you're only bridging a couple months, and plus the budget we adopted actually had about $600 million that we were going to put into a future rainy day fund. That rainy day we didn't realize was going to be now. And so we took that $600 million and say, we're not putting it into a rainy day fund. We need that to be liquid in order to be able to manage this crisis. But going into the next fiscal year, in order to balance our budget, we had to go through something called unallotment. And the unallotment is, essentially looking at all that new spending that we thought that we were going to be able to put into place and putting it on hold. So it's not getting rid of it, but it's basically giving the governor the authority to not spend that additional money until we have a better sense of what the economy is going to look like, with the idea that we're going to get back together in September for a special session. And then we can be more strategic about what do we want to allow spending on versus what we might want to go ahead and cut deeper. But, the idea was to unallot stuff across the board because right now we just don't know what the economic situation is going to look like. And it would be too hard at this point to pick and choose without days and days and days of very ugly debate. So anything new in general was simply unallotted. It was parked until we could make those decisions in September.
For those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we are talking with Delegate David Bulova about what happened at the reconvened session last week and how the horizon has changed dramatically from the 2020 legislative session, simply because the economy is in an unpredictable situation right now. But going forward, there were bills that were incredibly important. You hit on some of them. Let's use the last part of the show to hit on some of the other ones we haven't talked about that you think our listeners would be interested in.
Sure. And there were several different labor-related issues. Again, tying it to the veto session, and so minimum wage, increasing that over the next couple of years, prevailing wage. Those are items that we passed this year that do have some fiscal implications. And so what the governor asked us to do was he wasn't looking to veto it. He wasn't looking to get rid of the legislation. He was looking to delay that. And so kind of with heavy hearts, we agreed to do that. And most of the labor organizations understood that, it was better to have those bills signed and keep them moving, rather than having to start from scratch. But big areas, gun safety. This is something that I think is really going to be a hallmark for this session. And we made some really big strides. So putting in place a red flag law. So if somebody is exhibiting, that they are a danger to themselves or others, providing a process, due process with lots of protections to be able to temporarily remove weapons from a home, to making sure that we close loopholes in our background checks. So that gun safety was one of the big ones. It was also, again, talk about a surreal General Assembly session with tens of thousands of people marching on Richmond, engaging in their ability to protest, while we were in there legislating.
Yeah, that was something to see. Guns remain an enormous issue in the Commonwealth of Virginia, across the rest of the country as well. But Virginia's history with guns, like with many other things, we have people who believe that it's not just their right to bear arms, but it is a matter of their own protection. And there is a balance between, having the right to bear arms and having the right not to be shot. So,
right.
as a lot of the organizations like to put it. So we continue to make strides in that, trying to balance the two. But what are some of the other things? How about redistricting? Where are we with redistricting and the census?
So redistricting, that's going to be an interesting one, and that was a very vigorous debate during the General Assembly. And so, the ultimate decision was to present a proposed constitutional amendment to the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so that will be on the ballot, and the people will get to decide whether we want to implement a 16-member Virginia Redistricting Commission. And so I encourage anybody who's listening to really kind of dive into what is this Redistricting Commission, and whether this is what we want to see with respect to trying to take some of the partisanship out of the redistricting process, which has been a priority of mine for a number of years. The way that the Redistricting Commission will work is that 16 members, half would be legislators, half would be citizen members. And I guess a way to think about it is kind of the way that our federal system is set up. It's basically a system of checks and balances. And so the 16-member commission will be tasked with trying to come up with a map, that respects community boundaries. They have to be cohesive. They can't be long and weird shapes.
As they are now.
As my own district is now.
Your own district is very weirdly shaped.
There is a story behind my own district that I won't get into.
But, California has done this. Other states have done this. It's not like Virginia's doing something that has not been successfully done elsewhere.
Right. Yeah, I am absolutely positive that it can be done here in Virginia. The debate was, what is the proper structure for the Redistricting Commission, and what is realistic to be able to get through both the House and the Senate. And so, again, this is what kind of came out was, having these 16 members, legislators and citizens, a supermajority of each has to agree in order for that map to get presented to the General Assembly for an up or down vote. I think what part of the issue was, what if they can't agree? And so in that case, it goes to the Virginia Supreme Court. And under the rules that we would adopt, they would hire a special master, to come in and draw those districts. And so in Virginia, it's a little different with respect to our Supreme Court from the U.S. Supreme Court. So they're not appointed for life. In fact, they have to come back to us to be reappointed. And so they tend to be strict constructionists. If you think back to, your fourth grade civics lessons, they tend to be very deferential to the actual language of the law and not to venture too far from, what the law actually says. But for me, I think it's exciting that we've even gotten this far and that the people will have a chance to vote on whether this is something that they want to be able to implement for the 2021
redistricting.
elections.
Yeah, and we should put a plug in for the census. Obviously, the corona pandemic really impacted our ability to get people to respond to the census. Right now in Fairfax County, I think we're at about 60% response for a census that's supposed to be a snapshot of where everybody is living on April 1st. This is critically important. I think in the last census in 2010, it ended up being 73% of people in Virginia responded to the census, and that means there were a lot of people left uncounted. That
Right.
impacts the money we get from the federal government, but to Delegate Bulova's point, these maps are drawn, whether it's a nonpartisan redistricting commission or not. The maps are redrawn based on population. And when you've got 25% of the people who didn't respond and you don't know where they're living, then the districts are not going to be drawn accurately no matter who draws them.
Yeah, bingo, exactly.
So please, everyone, if you have not responded to the census, go online. You can do it by mail. You can do it by phone. This is not about who is a citizen or not a citizen. There's no citizenship question. What we really need to know is how many people are living where across the Commonwealth. And it really makes a difference. Elections make a difference. And from, like I said, from the freshman 15 in 2017 to taking a majority, the Democrats taking majority in the Senate and the House in 2019, this is critically important to our quality of life. What the General Assembly does is important to the quality of our lives. And I encourage people to understand who your delegate is if you don't know, who your state senator is if you don't know, when the session starts, when the session ends, how you reach your elected officials when you have an idea about a problem that needs to be solved.
Right.
Delegate Bulova, what's the best way for people to reach out to you?
Yeah, so the best way for people to reach out is to hit my webpage. And so from the webpage, it's got a description of all the different services, some of my priorities, but it also provides an email as well as a phone number for you to be able to reach out to me. And so that's www.davidbulova.com. Kind of getting to your point about knowing your legislator, it makes it tough for me to know how to represent any person if they don't go ahead and reach out. And so I love being able to come out to homeowners associations, civic associations. I will meet up with people at their local coffee shop. This is all about engagement, and the way that I can be a better legislator and a better representative is for people to reach out to me. And all of us really love to be able to help. That's kind of why we're elected officials in the first place.
Thank you so much for taking time to be with us tonight on Making Change Radio, which is every Thursday here on Radio Fairfax at 9 p.m.